we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about what family planning looks like. We're going to end up revisiting some of the information that we talked about this morning, but we're going to do that quite briefly because we actually have a lot to discuss. All right. So we have a lot of ground to cover. One of the first questions that families usually ask after they've had time to process everything with a diagnosis is, what do our family planning options look like? And so we do have plenty of things to discuss. My disclosures are not one of them. I have no conflicts of interest still. And so our objectives with this talk this afternoon are going to be to understand recurrence risks for LCC. We talked about that. We're going to do a little bit more detail. We're going to learn about the available reproductive options. There are a good number of options. Sometimes that is fantastic news because options are a great thing to have. And sometimes that's also incredibly stressful because it just means that there are more things to consider and there's no right or wrong way to feel about that. We're also going to understand, hopefully, pre-implantation and prenatal genetic testing options and also explore some alternative family building options as well. All right, so running back to a refresher from this morning, we've talked about this several times today, so I'm not going to spend too much time here because I think you guys have got it. So, as you already know, LCC is an autosomal recessive condition. Two disease causing variants are required to have the condition. One means you're a carrier. If you are a carrier and your partner is also a carrier, 25% risk to have an affected child, 50% risk to have a carrier child, and 25% chance to have an unaffected and non-carrier child. The thing that I want to emphasize with this specific slide that was not on the slide this morning is that risk resets with every single pregnancy. So if you have 4 children, there is no guarantee that you will have the one unaffected, the 2 that are carriers, and the one that is completely unaffected. And so that risk will reset with every single pregnancy, so those numbers will not change. All right, so something that we did not discuss this morning is, what about risk to siblings? So in this case, we're talking about the risk for siblings to be carriers similar to their parents. And so siblings of people that have LCC have a 2/3 chance of being a carrier. Now, this is a new number. How did we get there? So this is a similar diagram to what we have been seeing. The difference is that I'm showing you on this one how we got that 2/3 number. So typically, we already know whether or not that child is affected. So typically, we already know that they are unaffected. So that risk of them being affected is ruled out. So that means there are only 3 more options. And so 2 of them are being an unaffected carrier and 1 is a non-carrier. So this is how we're getting that 2/3 number for siblings. And so it's essentially the exact same reproductive considerations for a sibling who is a carrier as the parents. So still that 25-50-25 risk for those siblings if they are also a carrier. And so something to really emphasize on this side is that if there is a sibling who is a carrier, their partners should be tested for a SNORD 118 variant just to make sure that they're not also a carrier prior to considering starting a family, especially if their partner is already pregnant. All right, so something again to emphasize, because you guys know I love to re-emphasize things. This is going to be a recurring theme as well, so there is no one right choice. There are going to be a lot of options that we discuss during this talk today, but I really want to emphasize that every single family is different. And so something that might be the most ideal scenario for one family might not be that for another. And there are a lot of things that you have to take into consideration. So there's no one right choice for how you choose to expand your family. So different paths for everyone, but the available options that we're going to discuss today include spontaneous or natural conception, prenatal testing, which is also typically with that spontaneous natural conception. We're going to talk about IVF as well as pre-implantation genetic testing. And we're also going to talk about what IVF with a donor egg or a donor sperm looks like, as well as adoption. All right, so the first one that we're going to talk about is spontaneous conception. This is, again, just the ability where you become pregnant naturally or spontaneously. At this point, you can choose to test prenatally or you can choose to test after birth. And this is one of the least medically invasive options, of course, adoption. So this is the next few slides are just going to be talking about prenatal testing options. So you're already pregnant. What do we do now? So one of the first options that you have is called CVS or chorionic villus sampling. This can be performed as early as 10 weeks and usually up to 13 weeks. So, this is usually the fastest you'll be able to find out diagnostic information. And so, it just involves the removal of a small amount of the developing placenta that consists of those chorionic villi. And that can be performed in two ways, either transcervical or transabdominal. You don't really typically get a say in which one of these procedures that you get. It's usually based on things like anatomy and uterus placement. And this is 98 to about 99% accurate, which is very good. Usually, these are results that we can rely on. And again, they are diagnostic, not screening. So we would know for a fact if they actually had those familial variants. So next option would be amniocentesis, and this can be performed usually after 15 weeks gestation. The kind of end point for when they can do amniocentesis does vary, but this one is usually what people know a little bit more about is just the insertion of a needle into the amniotic space, into the belly to remove some of that amniotic fluid to grab those cells. This one is almost 100% accurate. I don't think we really get much more accurate than 99.9% in our space. And so again, this is just the needle going through the belly into that amniotic sac to grab those fetal cells, and then we test those for the familial variants as well. And again, this is also diagnostic testing. And so some additional considerations to think about with these prenatal test options, they may or may not be covered by insurance. I love that we all have a common enemy in insurance in this room. So you already know some of the limitations that can come with that. I'm going to be giving this is a disclaimer with the second point because it's important to note throughout the rest of this presentation. I am giving a lot of estimates based on just national averages for the cost of some of these procedures and some of these options. So it can vary depending on your location, depending on insurance, and several other many factors. So again, I'm giving you the national averages and ranges, but it might be different for your specific situation. So, of the options that we have discussed with CVS and Amnio, that can cost either a couple hundred to $1,000 out of pocket if they are positive. So, if the CVS is positive, if the Amnio is positive, you do have two options at that point. You can choose to either continue your pregnancy or you can choose to terminate your pregnancy at that point. And so, when we're thinking about the option of terminating the pregnancy, that is something that might not be protected. It might not be a protected reason in some states. It's also not available in some states. But again, there's no right or wrong decision for you. It's whatever is best for you personally or your family. And so, second option with our spontaneous or that natural conception, you can also just pursue your pregnancy all the way through and you can do postnatal testing. And so, after delivery, we can go ahead and have that infant be tested for the familial SNORD 118 variants. At that point, if they are positive, you could choose to consider adoption for that child, or you could choose to keep them within your family unit. And this option would have the could have the smallest financial impact. All right. And so now we're moving on to what IVF looks like. So IVF is again that in vitro fertilization with PGT-M, which is pre-implantation genetic testing molecular specifically because we know exactly what we're looking for. And so what is IVF and what does that process look like? I think we all have a little bit of an idea of IVF. I think we've all heard the term test tube baby thrown around somewhere. We personally don't use that, but when we're thinking about what that IVF process looks like, it starts with ovarian stimulation. And so that can look like taking hormonal pills, that can look like taking shots to help stimulate the ovaries to release those eggs. At that point, the eggs are then collected and then they will be fertilized with sperm in a lab. They let the embryos grow for a few days. And then the cells from those embryos will then be collected and they will perform the genetic testing, that PGT-M. Sometimes they'll do additional testing just to look at their chromosomes as a whole, to those embryonic cells to see if they have those SNORD 118 variants. And then embryos that do not have LCC will be transferred to the uterus. Right. So then what is PGT-M? And so this is again the pre-implantation genetic testing molecular because we know what we're looking for. And so you will usually have to provide the familial reports. Some places are not super fond of having a sibling report. They really want to be 100% sure that the parents have those variants. So sometimes they'll make sure that you are giving them your individual reports over that of another child. And this usually requires parental and sibling samples as positive controls for probe development. And so, because this is so specific, they have to develop very specific probes to make sure that they're looking for the correct targeted variants. And so, they'll make sure that they have all of that information before they're able to proceed. And some places might have limitations with regards to probes because probes can be expensive. And so additional considerations with this IVF with PGT-M, it's expensive. So the average cost can be about $20,000 to $25,000 a cycle. There's no guarantee that the first cycle will work. So that is per cycle, and you might have multiple cycles required in order to conceive. Some insurance plans might cover, which would be great, but some might not. And so that might be something that you're paying for fully out of pocket. It can also be very physically and emotionally demanding. I think especially when it's very involved, and so we're doing shots, we're taking pills, just the general stress of going through this process can be really demanding on families. And again, multiple cycles might be needed and success rates vary by couple. All right, so now we can talk about using a donor egg or using a donor sperm. And so, if you are using a donor egg, if you want to pursue a donor egg, you would just have to identify an egg bank. At that point, you can select an egg donor, and then you can just follow the IVF process that we just discussed. And you might be able to choose to forego PGT-M. That's just an option if you really want to be sure. You can also do some testing at that point as well. And so, moving on to donor sperm, identify a sperm bank, identify your sperm donor, and then again, you can choose to follow that IVF process, or at that point, you can choose to do IUI or that intrauterine insemination, which usually will drop that cost down a little bit. All right. And so those considerations are additional considerations for that donor egg or that donor sperm. It will and it can relieve that stress from the egg collection. It does increase the cost if you use a donor egg. So that range goes from 20 to 25 to 65 per cycle. The IUI is a lot cheaper than IVF if you do use that donor sperm. And so that is typically less than $4,000 across the board. And that does actually have a huge range from a couple hundred all the way up to 4,000, and it's a little bit less if there's no infertility on your end. And then if you do the IVF with the donor sperm, that would be a little bit more, maybe a little bit more expensive than traditional IVF, but that would run $22,000 to $28,000 a cycle. All right, and then we have our last option, which is adoption. And so I always like to emphasize that adoption is a family building option, is a true family building option. It does not always have to be a backup plan, and that's completely fine if it is, but it is a completely viable option. That includes domestic adoption, international adoption, and also foster to adopt programs, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail as well. Adoption does avoid any medical procedures. It also avoids familial genetic concerns. We can't say it avoids all genetic concerns because we don't know everybody's genes. They don't even know, but it does avoid any specific concerns that you would have. So in this case, hopefully, fingers crossed, it would also avoid LCC if that's something of concern. The waiting periods can be quite long for adoption, and there are varying costs, which again, we'll get into in a little bit more detail. There are also legal considerations and eligibility considerations. There's also adoptee trauma and adoption ethics that really need to be considered with this as well, which we just don't have enough time to go into today, but there are so many books and so many additional resources on those as well. All right, so looking at the costs of adoption, one of the cheapest options that you could see would be foster to adopt programs. And so there are some absolutely free programs in certain states or certain counties that would make it so that you could foster and then adopt without those additional costs on the front end. And then if you're paying, that could be up to $3,000, but again, that varies by the region. And then if you consider domestic, so within the continental 48, sometimes also including Alaska and Hawaii, that average cost ranges depending on the adoption agency that you use. And so that can range from $30,000 to $85,000, which I know is a significant range, but lots of additional factors go into those considerations. And then you can also do private or independent adoption, which can run $20,000 to $45,000. Again, a larger range, but also just depends on the different circumstances involved. And lastly, there's international adoption. And so that average range can be about $20 to $50,000, but that varies widely depending on the country that you adopt from. However, there are potential citizenship challenges and considerations for those children currently. And so I know we talked about a lot of options. There are a lot of things to think about. And again, I just want to make sure that we have reemphasize there are no right or wrong decisions for your family. And so some of the things that come into play when we're making that decision include our personal values, our religious beliefs, financial resources, the time that it takes to go through any of these options, age, and by age of the parents as well, just because there are just different factors and different life circumstances that happen at any age, your previous experience with LCC, your emotional readiness to expand your family, and the support system that you have around you. And so you very much so don't have to make this decision alone. It can feel like a lot to try to feel like that weight is on your shoulders. And I don't mean just as an individual, but also as a couple. And so there are plenty of people that you can speak to about this if you want to just talk out loud and have another person just hear you. And so you can talk to genetic counselors such as myself. You can talk to your geneticist. You can also talk to your maternal fetal medicine specialist. And then and the fertility specialist, once you want to get a little less clinical, you can also talk to therapists or mental health specialists, each other. We have built such a beautiful community here. So you can always try to bounce off of each other as well. And also other families with other genetic conditions, because they might have still some of those same similar considerations that you will. And so, our key takeaways, there are multiple family planning options available. Each option has its unique benefits and its own challenges. Genetic counseling can help families understand those choices and the risks associated. And again, there's no universally right decision, only that is right for your family. And with that, I thank you. Any questions? We're good online? Yes. So, excellent question. If your sister is a carrier, the first thing that she'll want to do is talk to her partner about getting tested for that SNORD 118, for any SNORD 118 variant. And so instead of doing specific targeted testing for a specific variant, they'll want to make sure that they can sequence the entire gene and analyze the entire gene, just to make sure that on both fronts there are no other variants of concern before they're able to conceive that child. And again, if that's not able to happen or if she's already pregnant, then at that point we can talk about those testing options as well. They can still get tested, but we'll want to make sure, usually on the front end, what that risk is.
And just to add to that, because not everybody understands the variants in SNORD 118 perfectly, if they find a variant on the partner's gene, reach out to me and we can talk about whether or not it's something that we've seen before or if it's in a region of concern.
What testing would need to be done for a sibling of the parent? So, like the mother's sister or
Yeah, so typically we will see one variant running through one side of the family. So if mom's sister wants to get tested or mom's brother wants to get tested, we usually would do targeted testing for that specific variant. That makes the most sense for us both clinically and financially, because usually that targeted testing is also a bit cheaper.
is it recommended?
Yes, especially if they're considering having children.
Perfect.
I think this question is like a whole question. So should we think about getting like our nieces or nephews tested to see if they're carriers of this gene?
Fantastic question. So, what we say if they're completely unaffected, have had no symptoms, and typically don't have concerns, is outside of the research realm. It's typically not recommended to test any children until they're closer to that age of 18. Now, once the kind of like sex conversations start, so around like 16 or maybe a little bit earlier, at that point, if they're interested and they really want that testing and understand what that means for them, you can do it a little bit earlier. But if they're definitely someone who might not get it until they're 18 or a little bit older, then that's the point when we really want to have that conversation. And at that point, yes, we want to make sure that they're getting that information, but typically not before. Thank you.